Welcome to this lecture on Augustine as a teacher. Before we start, I would just like to apologize that there might be some background noise because we are located, my convent is located along a street. So there are some noises that you might hear in the background, and we cannot really avoid it because we don't have a studio. So pardon that. I apologize for that, just in case it is inconvenient to you. So in this particular video, we will be talking about Augustine as a teacher. If you're going to look at the church's calendar, you will see there that Saint Augustine is labeled as bishop and doctor of the church. In our modern parlance, when we say doctor, it has many implications. It could be a medical practitioner, or it can be a professional teacher, or an expert in a certain field. So we call them doctor, especially if you finish your doctorate degree. Yet in the olden times, when we say doctor, doctore, it's actually referring to as teacher. So, how about the physicians or the surgeons, those who practice the medical arts? They are actually called as medicos. So, for example, in the scriptures, you will find out that Saint Luke was a physician. In our modern parlance, we can say that Saint Luke was a doctor. But to be precise, in the olden times, we will not consider Luke as a doctor, but rather as a medicos. So physicians and those who practice the medical arts are called medicos, while those who teach with authority are called doctors or doctore. So St. Augustine is a doctor of the church, which means that he is a teacher of the church. But more than just that lofty title of being a teacher of the church, Augustine really is a teacher. But in order to understand education at the time of Augustine, we have to look first the stages of education in the 5th and 6th century AD, or around that time. I think Augustine was in the 4th century. So, or was it in the 4th century? Anyway, yes, late 4th century, early 5th century. So, let's look at now the levels of the education. First, a child or a young lad or lass, but actually it's more of the boys rather than the girls, they would go and study with a literator, the one who teaches children to learn how to read and how to write, and maybe a little of arithmetic. We also call this person under whom the students will learn as magistre iode. So, the basic education starts with teaching the children how to read, how to write, and how to count. It's almost similar to our 3 R's, our reading, our writing, and our arithmetic. It's a little bit amusing that writing and arithmetic are considered as an R, maybe because of the sound. So reading, writing, arithmetic. So that's 3 R's for us. That's where we learn how to read, that's where we learn how to write, and that's where we learn how to count. So, that is also similar to the idea of education during the time of Augustine. But unfortunately, only 15% of the population are able to read and write, which is a very small percentage of 15. Out of 100, only 15 will be able to know how to read and how to write. And sometimes it is at the most basic level. So the relationship now in this particular level of education is more of a tutor the teacher serves here as a kind of a tutor. There's no really formal school that are as big as we have now. So possibly the students will gather at the house of their teachers, or maybe in a hall, a public hall, or in the house of the patron. So it's possible. But it is not as big as we imagine it nowadays, that the schools are immense in numbers, with the students numbering to thousands. Maybe also because of the population is now in the billions in some countries, while during the time of Augustine it's still small. So we can give or take some in the particular perspective. So, as I was saying, the basic level of education is to study under a teacher who will teach you how to read and write. And also, if they are Christians, to learn some scriptures and also to learn some works from the Latin classical literature. Many people during the time of Augustine do not know how to read and write. So, what is now their way of learning, or, how do they communicate? How do they transmit knowledge? Well, it's very obvious. If you don't know how to read, and if you don't know how to write, you listen. So listening is a very important way of learning. And I think that is the reason why preaching is very essential during the time of Augustine. To preach is to educate, particularly in the context of Christians. And the public orations are also important ways to transmit knowledge. That's why orators and, shall we say, preachers are skilled in conveying the message through their words. At that time, when we say you are reading, you read in a way that it is loud. So you've oral reading. Nowadays, what we have is we sometimes read silently, but that is not a common practice during the time of Augustine. When you read, you have to articulate it. You have to do it orally. And this is also the reason that during our liturgical celebration, like in the Mass, for example, or in a worship service, there are lectors. There are the time in the celebration that we have to read aloud from the scriptures, and because first, you don't have copies of the readings, so you listen. Nowadays, it's a different scenario, because we can always have the readings downloaded on our mobile gadgets, or on our phones or tabs or whatever you have there, and then you can read silently while listening to the lector. But my point is this: listening is a very important means by which the children at this time will learn. Okay, so that's the first step. Now, after the first step, you go to the second stage, and this is now similar to our high school, wherein the student will learn with the grammaticus, or the grammarian. Augustine was very lucky, because out of the 15 person who knew how to read and write, only half, about 7%, shall we say, was able to continue to the next educational stage with the grammaticus. In the Confessions, you see there that Augustine was about 15 years old when he was sent to a nearby city in Madauros. Some author would call the city Madaura, which is in the city of Algiers, now called Daurok. I don't know how to pronounce the name, but that's the place where Augustine studied with the grammaticus, or for his high school, if you want to have a contemporary parallelism to the stage. Here, Some scholars compare Madauros at that time as almost as the Oxford of that ancient time. So it's like going to a very famous city where learned and educated people gather and exchange their ideas and also to learn from one another. So Madauros is a very important learning or center of learning, and Augustine was very lucky to go there. One of the famous, shall we say, resident of Madauros was Apuleius. So Apuleius. He contributed not to philosophy but to literature, and he wrote what they consider nowadays as the first Latin novel called the Metamorphoses. So it's a work that is made immortal by having that particular epithet, which is to be the first Latin novel. So it's called the Metamorphoses by Apuleius. Here in Madauros, St. Augustine learned about Cicero, Virgil, Varro, and Salos. So those are the famous Latin writers. And because books are very expensive during that time, students have to learn it by memory. So you have to have a good memory in order to succeed academically during those times. You have to memorize the text because you don't have copies of the books. They are very expensive, and only the rich and those schools that are endowed with by wealthy patrons are able to procure books, and there are only very few copies during those times. So they have to learn it by memory. So first, in your elementary years, you have to be good listener. And I think it stimulates our capacity if you are just listening to memorize also, or to learn what you've heard by heart, because you don't have notebooks or papers during those times, which are again very expensive. There are writing materials during those times, but they are very rare and very expensive. So what you do is you learn by listening, memorize what you heard or what you read, and learn it by heart. So that when you are going to enter into a discourse, you will be able to quote from memory principles or parts of the literature which you are discussing. After one of the things that is significant in the time spent by Augustine in Madauros, and take note he was a teenager at this time, was that he would remember the pagan texts. I'm referring to the writings of the Latin writers like Cicero and Virgil. And he would remember this even during the last moment of his life. So, what can we say about this? What we learn in high school or in the elementary can stay with us for our entire life. And that is a very important data, not only now in the ancient time, but also nowadays, because we can really see here that at this early stage in the life of a person, during the elementary and the high school, their minds are really formed by the teachers. And whatever they learn from the teachers during this time, they can really bring it to the rest, bring it with them for the rest of their lives. So you see here that the influence of teachers is in fact life-changing, and it can, our testimonies, our values, our knowledge that we impart to the students can influence them for the good or for the bads. And that's a very good thing to remember when we are teaching, particularly things that we know might be dangerous. Yes, that's correct. Sometimes teachers are teaching students things that they thought is helpful, but actually in the long run is dangerous. We will discuss that in class. What are those things later. Now, after finishing his studies in Madauros, Augustine returned to Tagaste, and for a year was not able to continue studying because of financial problems. I think that is something that is afflicting many of our young people. They would stop studying because the coffers run dry or empty. I remember when I was younger, I was about to enter into college, I wanted to study in a city school here in Bacolod. I wanted to study in Bacolod in some of the universities here. Unfortunately, my mother is just a wage earner. She was a public school teacher, and she cannot afford to send me to school in Bacolod without getting into a lot of debts. And at that time, she was already in a lot of debts. You know, teachers most often are the victims of financial mismanagement. No? So, madamo utang ang akong iloy. Which is understandable because of a very low salary during those time. Better now that the teachers are already getting more or less decent salary. So I wanted to study in Bacolod City, but my mother told me bluntly that if you are going to insist Dio to go to Bacolod to study, you will only study for one semester and then you'll stop. Because she can only afford to send me to Bacolod for one semester. After that, I have to stop studying. And I was afraid. I was afraid to stop. And so I said, okay, I will just go to the college nearby and try to finish my college education. And the rest, of course, is history for me. So, and this is the thing that happened also to Augustine. After finishing his education with the Grammaticus in Madauros, he has to stop because Patricius and Monica do not have the financial resources to continue his education. But fortunately for Augustine, there was a rich man by the name Romanianus who became his benefactor, and he paid for the education of Augustine, this time in Carthage, the capital city of northern Africa at the time. And again, a very metropolitan city. So the third stage now of the education is almost similar to what we call nowadays as the university. And we can note that Augustine was indeed privileged to be able to reach this stage because this is only about 3% of the population who are able to reach the stage of this particular study, which is almost equal to university study. So you can see only 3% of the entire population, and that's a very small percentage. I do not know nowadays, maybe our literacy rate, and for those who reach college, may be around 60 or 70. I don't know, you supply the data. But this is far, far better than the 3% of Augustine's time. Here, Augustine studied rhetoric, and that is the art of persuading others by means of the words. As I said earlier on during this lecture, that words are the means of transmitting the knowledge that we have. If you notice, in comparing it, we still need words, but most often our learners learn by images and visuals. But during those times, it is by words. Now, if you notice, at this point in our discussion, that there is a connection between how you learn and how you teach. Listening is a basic skill that all learned people needs to acquire. And so, how do you supply words? So you supply, they have the basic skill of listening, and so you transmit through the medium of words, orality. Let's reflect. How about nowadays? What is the basic skill of an educated person? Maybe we can discuss this in our classes. You ask yourselves, what is now the equivalent skill of our students to that of listening during the time of Augustine? Is it still listening? I believe many of our teachers are telling us or are complaining that the students are no longer capable of listening. So if they are no longer capable of listening, maybe we can adjust our pedagogical methodologies if they're not listening anymore. But we need to identify first what is that skill. In Augustine, it's listening. And because that is an acquired skill, they supply it with words. Ngayon, what is that basic skill of the learners at a very early stage, and so that we can also try to identify how to be able to supply the needs. Okay, and that will be the subject of your discussion in this particular lesson. So, my dear students, please make your comments on that particular question. Okay, you may ask, what was the question, Father? The question is this: if in the time of Augustine, listening is the most important skill that is acquired by the student, and the words supply that listening and words, how about today? What is that skill learned by our students in the basic ed that will become their tool in learning? And as teachers, or those who are in the field of education, how do you supply it? And for those of you who are not in the field of education, how do you answer to that demand? Maybe by creating new technologies or whatever. And if you mention about technologies, particularly what kind of technology? Okay, so because many of our teachers are complaining, the children are no longer listening. They have very short attention span and so on and so forth. So if that is the situation, okay, given. But what are the skills that they have? And how do you supply that skill? Okay, so let's move on. In Carthage, Augustine learned about rhetoric. And as I said, rhetoric is the art of persuasion. The art of persuading others by means of words. In St. Augustine's time, the word was very powerful. It can persuade and move people effectively to a particular end or goal that the orator wants to bring them. Here in Carthage, Augustine read about one of the works of Cicero called the Hortensius. After reading this work, Augustine fell in love with wisdom, and he says in the Confession that he started to lift himself up to God. And certainly in that moment, Augustine did not know that this wisdom is actually Christ himself. So in a way, it is the beginning of the journey of Augustine towards wisdom. And that book that propelled him to that search for wisdom and ultimately for God is the book called Hortensius by Cicero. I do not know if you have read that book. For myself, I have not even seen a single copy of it, or even just a photocopy of that. No, so if I'm going to ask myself, what was the literature or book in this case that propelled me to where I am now? So maybe that's a good reflection for us to think. in terms of our journey in the life of wisdom, in a search for wisdom, and also in growing as a person that we are meant to be. What was that book that changed your life? For me, I can remember at the early on that I love to read the stories of the Old Testament. And I remember in the library in my high school at the time, I would always go to the library and check out that book, a Bible, but in pictures. The story of the Bible is not written in words, but illustrated by a lot of pictures. Almost everything is in pictures. So it's like a comics. It's a nice work of art, a work of literature, and I think that is the book that propels me to study and love the Bible. And as I told you, I am more at home with the study of the Bible as as a field of interest. And if you can see at the back, almost all of my books here, as well as what is the books that are inside my room, are in the field of biblical studies. Although I was not trained formally as a biblical scholar, but I learned a lot through my online classes from the various institutions, uh, where I finished online studies on the Talmud and the New Testament and the Old Testament, particularly the Torah. And it's a very nice experience. And this is something that I am really now very, shall we say, convinced that online learning is one of the ways by which we can really, hopefully, hopefully, answer to the needs of the millennials and the generation Z and the generation Alpha. So we have to adapt ourselves as teachers. So okay, so I will end our lecture here, and hopefully you learned something. And don't forget to answer in the comment section, which I will open in this particular lessons on the on the question which I would like to repeat now. If during the time of Augustine, listening is a very important skill acquired early on during their elementary years, in quotation marks, because there is no term as elementary during those time, but during their time with the Maester Iode or with the Literator, they identify it as listening. Now, because that is the skill acquired by the students, those in the higher education supplied it by training people to become very good orators or teachers of rhetorics. They transmit knowledge through the word, and people receive knowledge through listening. Nowadays, how about our students? Is listening still an acquired skill, or is no longer true? And if it is no longer true, can you identify what is that skill in that the elementary students would acquire that is equivalent to listening in the time of Augustine? So that when we are able to identify that skill that they have now, we can also supply that in the same way that those during the time of Augustine supply it with words. How about today? How do we supply it? I hope you enjoy our lesson today or in this particular section. Thank you.